He laughed at the farmer's house, but years later, he needed his help. There was once a young man named Ryan who grew up in a small countryside town, restless and hungry for success. He had always looked at the narrow dirt roads, the quiet farms, and the slow pace of rural life with a kind of disdain. To him, the people who stayed there lacked ambition, content with mediocrity. Among them was one farmer, old Mr. Turner, whose wrinkled hands told stories of decades spent working the soil. Ryan had often seen him in the fields, his clothes tattered, his face marked by sun and age, and he would smirk, whispering to his friends how pathetic that life must be, to live surrounded by cows, crops and mud while the rest of the world moved forward. When Ryan was 18, he left the town with a firm promise to himself. He would never come back. He wanted wealth, fame, recognition, everything that the farmer's humble world could never offer. His family watched with hope as he took a bus to the city, carrying nothing but an old suitcase and dreams that burned brighter than reason. In the city, life moved fast. The streets were loud, the lights endless, and success felt almost within reach. Ryan worked hard, too hard, chasing every opportunity, every shortcut, every promise that glimmered like gold. He started small, running errands at an office, then moved up quickly. He was ambitious, sharp-tongued, and bold. Soon he was wearing suits, driving cars he couldn't quite afford, and posting pictures that made his old town friends envy him. Every time he remembered the old farmer's muddy boots, he smiled with pride, convinced he had escaped that life forever. But success built on arrogance has a way of crumbling faster than anyone expects. One decision changed everything. A deal that looked too good to be true, and was. Ryan invested all his savings, even borrowed from friends, hoping to double his money overnight. But within weeks, the company collapsed, and the man who had convinced him vanished without a trace. In a moment, everything he had built, his car, his apartment, his social status, vanished. The people who had once praised him disappeared too. The city that once seemed full of opportunity turned cold and distant. Rent notices piled up. His phone stopped ringing. He tried to rebuild, but every door closed, every interview ended in rejection. Soon, the once proud young man found himself sitting alone in a dark apartment, staring at an empty refrigerator, wondering how his dreams had turned into nightmares. When the eviction notice finally came, Ryan packed what little he had left into a single backpack and walked out into the rain. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere to go. Pride kept him from returning home at first, but hunger and exhaustion have a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. With heavy steps, he boarded a bus, the same kind he had taken years ago, heading back to the countryside he had once mocked. When he arrived, the village looked the same, though quieter than he remembered. The fields stretched wide, the wind carried the scent of soil and hay, and the old farmer's house still stood at the edge of the road. It was smaller than he remembered, yet strangely full of life. Chickens clucked near the fence, and a dog barked lazily from the porch. Ryan hesitated before walking closer. He didn't know if the farmer would even recognize him. He knocked gently, and after a few moments the door opened. There stood Mr. Turner, older now, his back slightly more bent, but his eyes still carrying that calm steadiness that Ryan used to laugh at. The old man looked at him for a long moment, and though Ryan expected scorn or questions, there was none. The farmer simply stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. That night, Ryan ate the first real meal he'd had in days. He slept on a small bed near the kitchen, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him like a forgotten memory. The next morning, he tried to explain himself, to offer payment he didn't have, to express shame that words could never fully carry. But the farmer stopped him. He didn't ask for money or apologies. He only pointed toward the fields outside, the same fields Ryan had once ridiculed, and said quietly, not with words but with a gesture, that there was work to do. So Ryan worked. Days turned into weeks. His hands blistered, his back ached, and every morning started before dawn. At first he resented it. He hated the smell of soil, the roughness of the work, the simplicity of the meals. But slowly something began to shift inside him. The silence of the field started to calm the noise in his mind. The routine gave him discipline. The sweat gave him peace. He began to notice things he had never cared about before, how the sunrise looked when it spilled across the hills, how the wind whispered through the wheat, how hard the farmer worked without ever complaining. Mr. Turner never lectured him, never reminded him of the mockery from years ago. Instead, he led by example, Patient, consistent, humble. Months passed and Ryan grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. He learned how to plant, how to harvest, how to mend tools, how to listen. The land taught him what the city never did, that real success isn't about what you have, but who you become. Then one day the old farmer fell ill. The man who had carried the weight of the earth for decades could no longer walk to the fields. The doctor came, shook his head, and said he needed rest. Ryan sat by his bedside for hours, watching the man who had once been a symbol of everything he despised now lying frail, yet peaceful. It was in that quiet moment that Ryan understood. He realized that life had brought him back not to humiliate him, but to teach him. The same hands he had once mocked had now fed him. The same house he had laughed at had given him shelter. The same man he had looked down on had lifted him up when no one else would. Ryan took over the work on the farm. The days were long and lonely without the farmer's voice nearby, but he pushed through, determined to honor the man who had shown him what true strength meant. Under his care, the farm began to flourish again. Crops grew taller, animals thrived, and for the first time, Ryan felt a kind of pride that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Years later, people from the nearby towns began to notice. The once struggling farm had become one of the most prosperous in the area. Visitors came to buy fresh produce, to learn the techniques that Ryan had perfected through patience and failure. They asked him about his success, and he always smiled quietly, looking at the old photograph of Mr. Turner that hung on the wall. He never spoke much about his past, but sometimes late at night he would walk out into the fields and look up at the stars. He would remember the laughter of his younger self, the arrogance, the ignorance, and he would whisper a quiet apology to the wind. He had learned through hardship and humility that success is not about escaping where you come from, but about growing strong enough to carry it with you. Years after the farmer's death, the townspeople built a small plaque near the entrance of the farm. It read, "In memory of the man who sowed kindness where others sowed pride." Ryan never took credit. He simply kept working season after season, teaching young people who came to learn, some of whom reminded him painfully of his younger self. One afternoon, a young man from the city arrived, full of excitement and ego, asking Ryan if he could use the farm for a photo shoot. He wanted a rustic backdrop for his social media. Ryan watched as the boy laughed at the mud on his shoes, complaining about the smell, mocking the chickens, just as he once had. For a moment, Ryan felt anger rise within him. But then he remembered Mr. Turner's calm eyes, his silent patience, and he smiled instead. He offered the boy water, showed him around, and let him finish his photos. Before leaving, Ryan handed him a small bag of fresh vegetables and said nothing. He knew time would teach that boy the same lesson life had taught him, that pride is fragile, but kindness lasts forever. When the boy drove away, Ryan stood by the fence watching the dust settle on the road. He felt the wind move through the fields again, carrying whispers of the past, of laughter, regret, forgiveness, and grace. He turned toward the house, its wooden walls weathered but strong, its windows glowing softly in the setting sun. Inside, the fire flickered gently, and on the table lay the old farmer's hat, still waiting, still present in spirit. Ryan took a deep breath, his heart full of gratitude. The world had once laughed at the farmer's house. Now that same house had become a beacon of quiet strength, a reminder that life has a way of humbling the proud and honoring the kind. And in that stillness, Ryan smiled, not with arrogance this time, but with peace, because he finally understood that the greatest harvests are born from the hardest seasons.